Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Hey, welcome to Podcast Envy, episode 88. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klender. And one thing I don't love about summer in my neighborhood is that there is never a quiet moment to record a podcast intro, unless you want to record it between like the hours of 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. I think that is your best bet. Otherwise, you've got construction and loud music from the neighbors and weed whackers and leaf blowers and leaf blowers in summer. I don't know. Go figure. There is always sound no matter what I do, unless I block out my windows and make everything as soundproof as possible. Yeah, I don't have the time or patience for that project. And plus, I like sunlight. In any case, that's neither here nor there. Today, I am continuing a conversation I started over on my other show, The Creative Imposter, with somatic sex educator and producer and host of Wild and Sublime, Karen Yates. That was a mouthful. In 2020, Karen was practically propelled into podcasting by the pandemic when her live Chicago talk show was shut down through no shady behavior of her own. She needed a clever, COVID-friendly way to stay connected with her audience, build community, and do what creatives do, create stuff. Of course, I've known Karen Yates from way back before podcasting was even a twinkle in my eye, when we were both heavily into the Chicago theater scene. And so it's been really fun to witness her evolution from director to sound therapist with this cool modality called biofield tuning to somatic sex educator to podcaster. We had this conversation back in December of 2020, and since then, Karen smartly decided to team up with me and the Creative Imposter Studios to help with editing and strategy consulting for Wild and Sublime, and now, here we are, half a year later. What have we learned? Well, before recording this, I let Karen review my transcript from this episode, and here's what she had to say. Whew, that is still all on target. I stand by what I said. I suppose I could add that from your perspective, I've moved into alternating between shorter and longer episodes, and it's working well. And that working with you has been a game changer. That, and that the process of integrating energy work into the podcast is new and an exciting direction. But that's another conversation. On that note, to clarify, Karen was talking about her work as a somatic sex educator on Wild and Sublime because the show is, about sex and education. But she was hardly ever, if ever, mentioning her work in biofield tuning. And she brought it up one time in an episode, and I said, yes, do that. That sounds totally natural. Do more of that. And so now she is. If you're a business owner, entrepreneur, or freelancer with a podcast, and you're not talking about what you do on your show, why not? Start. Even if you think it's unrelated, there is always a way. And it's your show. You can do whatever you want. For example, hi, I'm Andrea Klender. I produce and edit podcasts and consult on launching and content strategy. Want to work with me? Click the link in the show notes to send me a message. See? Painless. You can find links to Wild and Sublime and Karen Yates in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/PodEnvy088. And now, on with the show. Karen Yates, thank you so much for joining me for Podcast Envy. How are you today?
It's so nice to be here. Thank you.
And so let's talk about Wild and Sublime, because when I saw what you were doing this year with your show, I was so impressed. And of course, Karen would have made a brilliant, fast pivot when the world went to shit, right? And you were doing this live show, like a sex positive variety show. Would you describe it that way?
It was probably really more like a talk show in the more traditional styles of like Jimmy Fallon or the old Carson show, where there was a one-on-one interview, a panel discussion, and then a couple of bits thrown in, like a couple of burlesque dancers or a storyteller, maybe a fun demo. But the bulk of it really was about conversation. So I usually say talk show with entertainment. That's kind of the best way, I think, to describe it.
On the podcast, you call it sexy infotainment. What is the phrase that you use?
Oh, a sexy spin on infotainment.
Yes, sexy spin on infotainment. I'm like, This is like the perfect tagline. I need you to start writing my puns and my taglines for all of my content. Seriously.
Well, it's funny. All of this has been registered with the U.S. government. Yeah. I'm like, these are good phrases.
And that's the producer side of you.
Yeah, that's totally the producer side of me. What can I say?
Where did the idea for that show originate, and what kinds of places were you performing?
Well, I was in the process of finishing out my somatic sex education certification, which is basically dealing with sexuality and sex education from a body standpoint. I had been in theater for many years. I had been a producer, director, performer, writer, playwright. There was a deep history in my background of live performance. So I was sitting in my apartment one night.
I feel like there's so many stories that start this way.
Right, as you do. And I was just kind of feeling like, I should probably do a workshop or something soon. I kind of stoke the fires, get things going. And I was just kind of like, I don't really want to do a workshop. I just didn't. I kind of always feel myself on the inside. I kind of feel what's going on? Where do I want to go? And as I say, all of a sudden, the whole idea just dropped into my head. Literally, it just dropped into my head and I saw the whole thing. I mean, it was all about like a panel discussion with a little one-on-one. And pretty quickly, I thought, I don't know if this is going to hold people's attention. I should add burlesque dancers.
We need tassels and glitter.
We need tassels and glitter. And that was the beginning point. That was really the beginning point.
Burlesque dancers? Glitter? Just what is this show actually about? We've used the word sex positive, and I know that I think I only heard that phrase maybe like in the last 2 years of my life. So like 40 years on this planet, having never heard that phrase before.
For me, the idea of sex positivity, and there are a number of definitions, but it's really that we are free to express ourselves however we would like, as long as it's consensual. What happens with folks, for the most part, is, let's say you identify as cisgendered, monogamous, and with a vanilla sexual lifestyle. So what happens a lot in society is that people just take it for granted that is what they are, and they don't think that there's anything beyond. And I'm not saying that like non-monogamy and kink are definitely what's beyond it for anyone.
Right.
What I mean to say is people don't explore.
Okay.
They don't explore their bodies. They don't explore new things with partners. They don't know the connection they have to their body. They don't even know how their body responds. Maybe there's been trauma. So there's sort of a low pressure system, if you will, always at work when it comes to people and their intimacy. So sex positivity, like sometimes I think when you listen to the podcast, which is now a bit different from the show, it gives people just ideas like, that's interesting. And it's just like little drops. It's like little droplets into the mind of like, I could think about this differently. And maybe you just listen to the podcast and you go on your merry way and you don't really think very much, but something's just gotten dropped in that like, hey, it's okay to have a desire in this direction. It's okay to want to explore this thing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's really about, for me, the show and the podcast is about removing the shame.
As I mentioned in the intro, Wild and Sublime was originally a live show in Chicago, originally called Super Tasty, in which Karen was like a talk show host and would invite various guests from the sex positive community in to talk about, topics and to do performances. You can hear the full story of how the live show got started on my other podcast, The Creative Imposter, episode 132. But when the COVID pandemic struck and live shows necessarily were shut down, what's a good producer to do? Throw in the towel? Host it on Zoom? Nope, that's not what Karen decided to do. I mentioned that you had made a pivot from the live shows to the podcast. How did you come to the conclusion that that was the pivot you were going to make, and how has it been going?
So from the very beginning of the show, I recorded it. I recorded audio. I don't know what it is. I'm not a video person. I don't like video. I'm not watching YouTube. I know everyone, like, they will go to YouTube for everything. I'm not one of those people. It's very weird.
Me either.
But I am a huge audiophile. And people are like, you should record the show. And I'm like, okay, I will audio record the show. Because I knew in the back of my mind, like, I'm like, that's important. Just audio record the show. I didn't even know why it was important, but I knew it was important. And then in January of 2020, I was approached about kind of moving the show forward into more of a video realm. And I was like, wow, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And there was a part of me that was like, I don't feel right yet. This doesn't feel correct. And I talked to someone in the industry. She said, you know what you should do? She's like, you should do a podcast. And the minute she said, I had been resistant because up until then I was like up to my eyeballs in work. I'm like, the last thing I'm going to do is launch a podcast right now. But the minute she said that, I remember this is January.
Right. Pre-COVID, pre-pandemic.
Pre-COVID. So I was like, yeah, she's right. That's a great idea. That is a great idea to move the show forward into a bigger audience. So I started wrapping my mind around it. I'm like, okay, what would it look like? You know, starting already to like sift, like, okay, how am I going to do this? What's it going to look like? How often am I going to do it? And then March 13th, the last Wild and Sublime show, like the last helicopter flying out of Saigon. I mean, that was the weekend in Chicago where like hell broke loose. And, you know, half my guests canceled. This was before everyone kind of had a protocol, but I was like, okay, we're going to cut the ticket sales. We're going to do social distancing. We're going to have hand sanitizer. No one was doing masks at that point, but you know, at that point, I think we all thought it was going to be 2 months.
At most, I remember thinking like, oh, a few weeks.
Yeah. So when it really got real, I think by April, I was starting to index my files, index my audio files. I have a lot of Virgo in my charts. I was starting to index my files. I was creating spreadsheets about what segments were usable, what were just so bad audio-wise, because like some files did not make it. But most of them did. And then I called an audio engineer friend of mine and he sweetened some of the files that were really gnarly. But it's so funny. It's like everyone's like, oh, you did it so quickly. And to me, it seemed like molasses. I'm like, I can't get this thing off the ground. I knew nothing about podcasting, like nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, I listened to podcasts. The podcasts I mostly listened to were things that were like NPR produced or American Public Radio produced.
With a team and studios and a huge budget.
Yeah, and sponsors. And because I was a voiceover artist and had worked in studios and had worked in sound booths, my idea of quality was much higher than, say, the people, which, like, I remember someone said to me, Karen, you don't understand. People record their podcasts in their cars. And I was like, oh, come on. No, they don't. And then just the other day, I heard my first recorded in a car podcast. And I was like, this really does happen. People do it. So I guess the good thing is I had a sense of what I wanted and I knew how I wanted to do it. And so, you know, I got the music. You know, a friend of mine actually wrote the theme song. And, you know, I was lucky in that I had connections in the industry and I knew people I could ask questions of. And I just learned as I went and it was so hard. So it took me like really 4 months to get my act together. But end of July, I had, you know, 3 episodes ready to go.
And 4 months during an incredibly stressful time of life.
Right. And then there was my sound work that I had to get online too, because I was at that point, I was doing it all pretty much live, like in person. I knew it could be done remotely. And now that's what I do for the most part. And I love it. But then there was getting that business online. So you're right. It was loco. It was loco.
And now it's time for our podcast angel. This is the segment where I get to share with you a favorite product, service, tool, program, etc. that I just know is going to make your podcasting life a little less loco. Today, I'm happy to introduce a brand new angel to add to our choir. This angel's name is Descript. Okay, full disclosure, Descript has been my angel for a couple of years now, and I'm not sure how I ever even edited and produced podcasts, especially my more narrative style podcasts, without it. In fact, I'm looking at notes that I wrote in a transcript in Descript right now. Wild. Descript is an editing software that transcribes your raw audio and then allows you to edit the audio from the text, almost just like editing a Google Doc. Plus, I use the transcripts to move content around, share with clients, refer to for writing show notes and blog posts, and for pulling social media quotes for guests. While software, of course, is no replacement for a skillful human editor, Descript is a must-have for the DIY podcaster. Follow my link in the show notes to start your free trial so Descript knows I sent you, and that way they can send me a little thank you bonus for the kind introduction. That link is thecreativeimpaster.com/DE-script. And now enough about podcasting. Let's talk about podcasting. What do you love about doing it in this format versus what has been challenging or pulling your hair out about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm an extrovert, and I'm not like an uber extrovert. I'm kind of maybe a blend or an ambivert. I don't know what they're calling it these days, but I need people, but I don't really want to do a partner podcast. I love panel discussions. I love moving the ball down the field with a bunch of people and the fluid conversation that could come out of a panel. So how's it going? It wasn't until I went to my first podcast conference online that I realized everybody struggles with overwork. That this is real. If you want to do it right, whatever right means, if you want to do it well, it requires a certain amount of commitment. And that commitment, if you don't have a boundary with yourself, can be wildly overwhelming.
Yep.
So I put out 16 weekly episodes, and people were like, "Why weekly, Karen? Why weekly?" And I'm like, because that's what's successful. and so people are like, you don't have to you could do it once a month. I'm like, that's for losers. I mean, I had a very, I had this really built in, need to succeed. And so I got 16 episodes out and began addressing some of my own trauma, which tells me I need to be an overachiever and a superachiever, and that there's a right way and a wrong way. And what ended up happening is I was like, okay, I need a little break. Okay, I'm going to rebroadcast the COVID episode because it makes sense and I want to do that. Okay. So I did a rebroadcast. So I bought myself a little time.
The rebroadcast Karen is talking about is an episode that she recorded with a panel of who she calls sexperts early on in the pandemic, talking about dating during shelter in place, and another episode about long-term relationships during shelter in place. Now, in most contexts, I'm not a huge fan of rebroadcasting episodes. If I follow a particular show and listen to every episode of that show, I get annoyed when I see rebroadcasts in the feed. At best, I know it's a rebroadcast and I just skip it. At worst, it's not clear to me it's a rebroadcast, and then I start listening to it, and then I'm like, podcasting deja vu. I feel like I've heard this before. Have I? And then I just get all irritated when I can't figure it out, or when I have listened to it and then I realize I just wasted 5, 10, 15 minutes figuring that out. However, there are instances when I think digging into your archive and bringing previous content forward can be really useful. And in this case, rebroadcasting these episodes not only bought Karen time on her end, while still providing content for her listeners, when she rebroadcasted them, the context was a little bit different because of what was going on in the world at that moment. So perhaps the timing of the rebroadcast was even better And because her show had grown so quickly in such a short period of time, I'm sure those episodes were reaching a brand new audience that may never have caught them on the first time around. And that's thinking like a smart producer.
And I think the next thing that happened was I got real clear. I'm like, you really actually need to take a couple of weeks off. And this was a very new idea. Not take a couple of weeks off with 4 episodes in the can, take time off. Not that. That's not what I've done that. If I'm going on vacation, I'm going to work like a dog and I'm going to have 4 in the can and I'm going to take some time off.
Yeah.
And that's punishing. That's punishing as hell. But it's just like, take time off. And it was so funny because people were like, yeah, when you said you were taking like 2 weeks off for a season break, I thought to myself, wow, that's not a lot of time. And I was like, really? Because like, I have no sense of what's, good self-care in this. I mean, I know what good self-care is
in this
around
context.
Erotic mindfulness, sure. But like this. So what has happened is something is getting reset. There are 2 things that are getting reset. One, my relationship with myself as podcast producer and host. But I'm also drilling down into the things about the podcast that feed me. And what feeds me are deep conversations. And up until this point, the show bobbled a lot back and forth with new content and old show content in sort of a cabaret style. Quick moving segments. Well, quick moving segments take a lot of time to edit.
Yes, they do.
And they sound great and everyone loves them, but they take a lot of time. And I do have a staff. Actually, I do pay a freelancer to do graphic design, the website and the e-blasts. And also I have an associate producer that does a lot of the social media writing. I couldn't do it all.
I already said it, but I'm going to say it again. After recording this episode, Karen actually hired my team to edit content and mix audio for her show, thus freeing her up to focus on what she does best. And that, once again, is thinking like a smart producer.
I could not do that by myself, period. I could not do that. But I'm realizing now that I have, a number of months of the podcast done, the things I love, the things people really love is when the conversation gets really, really deep about what makes us go sexually. Like, what are our obstacles? What keeps us from communicating? What keeps us from our sexual freedom? And I'm like, that's the juice. That's the real juice. And that's what I got to be concentrating more on, because that makes me feel alive. You can work really hard. I'm a hard worker, and I'm always going to be. If you can tap into the passion, and if it's really worth it, then everything's fine. But if you're doing stuff that is really not, if you're only doing it tedious because you think you have to do it, it's not a good thing. And honestly, I don't think everyone should be doing a weekly podcast, even though, yes, they say that's a success thing. That's what's going to make the mark. It's not for everyone. Or you can do variations. I mean, the podcast world is filled with variations.
Yeah.
So you can do a long episode and a tiny episode.
Yeah, I think that's so smart, because as also somebody who is very this recurring phrase in my mind of like, must produce, must create content. It's like, who is that voice? What is happening? And I've always had it. I've had it as long as I can remember, since I was a child. And it certainly wasn't my parents. My parents were like, take a break. No, don't take a break by working on something else. Just like sit there, don't do anything. They were telling me this as a child, and I'm like, I have to do something. And so I totally resonate with that. And then as a podcast coach and consultant, people do have this preconceived idea of what it will take to have a successful podcast. And there are the things like a weekly show. It has to have detailed show notes. It has to have social media. It has to have this. Maybe we have to have segments. If you have a large budget and can outsource a lot of things and have a lot of time, sure, maybe you can do all of that stuff. But can we figure out, why is it that you think you need those things? And I had to really release this idea. And it's funny because they'll say, okay, well, it doesn't have to be weekly, but maybe it has to be consistent. So whatever schedule you pick, you need to be consistent. If it's going to be once a month, it's going to be once a month. If it's going to be every other Wednesday, it has to be every other Wednesday. And I realized for myself that as I got busier and busier as a business, my clients' work was taking priority over my show. And I felt like a failure because of that. I'm like, I should be the shining example for my clients of what they should be doing. Like my show should be consistent. My show should be this. And then I was like, no, actually, work is work. And my show will come out when my show comes out. When I feel like producing more episodes, I will produce more episodes. When I feel like taking a step back and producing less, I'll produce less. If the social media graphic comes out with the episode, great. If the social media post comes out a week later, great. And what is so cool about podcasting is it's so free. So going back to like tying it into this idea of sex positivity, I'm like, maybe we have podcasting positivity where it's like, the brilliant thing about podcasting is you are not a broadcaster on a network with a corporate overlord that is telling you, unless you actually are on a network with a corporate overlord, which that's a whole other thing. But if you're an independent podcaster, nobody is telling you what your schedule has to be. Nobody is telling you you have to have segments or you have to have interviews just because that's what you think people are doing. My show is for my listeners, but it's also really for me. And I found that this year that I'd kind of gotten bored with podcasting and with my show. And then this year happened and it became a way of connecting with other people. And I couldn't wait to get on Squadcast like we are right now and have a great conversation about things that felt important. It felt like there was like a reason for us to be connecting and a reason for us to be having these conversations that was mutually beneficial to us rather than, oh, I need to do an interview for my show. And I think it just goes back into that freedom and exploring what is pleasurable to you, what feels good to you, what puts you in to like this state of flow versus what are you doing because you feel like you should.
Totally. And there's the resistance I had initially around this kind of change is, oh my God, I'm going to lose people. And I'm like, well, my designer, whenever someone unsubscribes to the E-list, I'm like, And he's like, it's making the list stronger. And I'm like, what? But it's like people who want it will want it. People that don't want it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I realize that as I find myself, and I love how you just described that all, it's like really finding the pleasure of podcasting. As I find my own pleasure in doing the podcast, others resonate to it. And it's so clear the episodes that I'm like, oh man, that was awesome. A lot of people are like, that was awesome, and I'm like, right, immediate reflection.
Of course. So you've had this break and you're about to come back and you've really reflected on this idea. And also I think too, just from a practical standpoint, what works live and what works like knowing the medium. And having had some experience with the medium of like, is it these short segments that work well for the podcast? Or does it lend itself to these deeper conversations, these longer, deeper conversations? And just kind of really seeing what translates in what medium and in what context, I think is really smart to think about as well. And I'm curious for you, like what is next with the show? I mean, you said that the live show will come back at some point, but we don't know when.
I've started really building out my Patreon game. So I'm giving, letting Patreon members do Q&As and it's its own episode. So bringing on like 3 panelists to answer Patreon questions. And then it's like a nice, juicy 45-minute conversation.
Patreon. We've talked about Patreon on this show before, and to be honest, I'm kind of a little bit jealous of how Karen has set up her Patreon. It has a cool name, which is the Afterglow. It has a very well-defined perk that is not only a perk for her Patreon supporters, but also a great source of new content for her main show. And something that I think is an underrated benefit of setting up a high quality Patreon is that it can also be used as a great platform for community building, even more so or as much as a revenue generator. And of course, the revenue generating and the monetary strategies are important too. That's, you guessed it, Thinking like a smart producer. I haven't been on your Patreon. How's it going in terms of like getting people signed up on there? Because I know some people have great success on that platform and some people, AKA me, do not. And so I'm just curious how that's been working.
Basically, it brings me in an income. I have like about 14 people, 15. Mm-hmm. And I realized recently around the Q&A, like, oh, yes, I see. It's not just about bonus content here or there. I need to build out like monthly consistency. And so I just recently revamped everything to just make it very consistent. Like, this is what you get. And again, making it pleasurable for myself. Right.
Yeah.
So that's going well. I had a sponsor for a long time during the show days and also early into the podcast. And now we're renegotiating contracts. And I'm also seeing and I have a second sponsor as well. It's been good going after the monetary aspects for the show as well. So it's like staying with the podcast, but also I'm doing partnerships. Like I'm in a partnership right now with #Open, which is a dating site. We're doing a media partnership right now. So it's always about, for me, it's always about connecting. How can I connect more with other people, other companies to make it, as you said earlier, mutually beneficial? That's what's interesting to me. How can I make this worth your while as much as worth my while? So basically, I think I'll start wrapping my mind around another Chicago show when it's easeful to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thinking of our Podcast Envy listeners and those who are currently podcasting or aspiring to be podcasting, what is your best advice right now for podcasters?
Have a game plan before you begin. So let's say you want to do something on video games or, I don't know, essential oils. I don't know. Do a little research. See what's out there. See how does my podcast, will it differ? Even though I have knowledge, I also feel like I didn't know anything about podcasting. Understand who you are personality-wise. If you're a type A, then you're probably going to have a tighter podcast game. If you're a type B, it's probably going to be a little looser. So make sure that your podcast lines up, just like we talked today. It lines up with, what's going to serve you? How is the podcast going to serve you? What keys does it unlock in you?
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.